painting that whispers, and a voice that should not exist. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Your thoughts bring this mystery to life. Where are you tuning in from tonight? I can't wait to read your comments. Let's begin. It was on a bitter January evening, the kind where the fog rolls in from the Thames like a patient assassin, that a most singular case first made its presence known at 221B Baker Street. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and Holmes, ensconced in his armchair with fingertips pressed together, stared with such unwavering focus at the ceiling that one might have believed he was willing the plaster to reveal secrets. I had returned only that morning from a short stay in Bath, and found Holmes in what I had come to regard as one of his less communicative moods. Neither violin nor monograph could rouse him. The fire was lit, the curtains drawn, and the world beyond seemed a ghostly grey whisper. I had just set down my tea when Mrs. Hudson appeared with a hesitant knock. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." Holmes sat up, eyes alight with sudden purpose. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps a fresh pot of tea strong." The man who entered was tall and broad-shouldered, though his shoulders seemed drawn by an invisible weight. His long overcoat was dusted with frost, and beneath his cravat I saw the flush of agitation. He doffed his hat with a trembling hand and fixed his eyes on Holmes. "I am Sir Alister Greaves of Hampstead," he said, "and I fear something monstrous is unfolding within my own home." Holmes gestured toward the empty armchair opposite. "Then let us tame the monster, Sir Alister. You have come to the right place. Begin, if you please, at the beginning, but spare us no detail, however trivial it may seem." Sir Alister nodded and leaned forward. "My wife, Evelyn, and I reside at Greaves Hall, a Georgian estate just beyond the heath. Last week we returned from a brief visit to Dorset. That very night, just past 11, I heard a voice. Voices are not uncommon in a large house," I ventured, though Holmes waved a silencing hand. "Not just any voice," Sir Alister continued. "It came from within my study. The room was empty, but the voice spoke clearly, directly, as though it were addressing someone." "What did it say?" Holmes asked. "Only 3 words." "Why did you?" "Then nothing." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And you were alone at the time?" "I was standing outside the study. Evelyn was already upstairs. We had no guests, no servants on that floor. I searched the room myself, windows locked, the fireplace cold. But—" He paused. "There is one thing." The voice seemed to come from the wall, specifically from behind a portrait that hangs over the hearth. Holmes' brows lifted, and he leaned slightly forward. "A portrait?" "My great-uncle Algernon, painted in 1834, quite dour, but harmless. It's hung in that room for decades." "Did you inspect behind it?" "Yes, nothing but plaster and brick." Holmes sat in silence for several moments. Then, to my surprise, he asked, "Has anyone in your household died recently?" Sir Alister flinched, and his gloved hand tightened on the armrest. "A fortnight ago, my cousin Edwin, a reclusive man, was found drowned in the ornamental pond on the estate. But his death was ruled accidental. He'd been drinking. There was no foul play." "And you believe otherwise?" I do not know what I believe," Sir Alister admitted. "But 2 nights later Evelyn heard the voice too, the exact same words. And last night, again. We are not superstitious people, Mr. Holmes, but the effect is unnerving." Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, your coat." "Sir Alister, we leave at once." "But the hour—" "Night is no impediment to truth. In fact, darkness may serve us better. Tell me, Sir Alister, has anyone ever attempted to remove that painting?" "Not in my memory." Holmes smiled faintly. then I believe it is high time someone did. And so it was that not an hour later I found myself bundled once again into a hansom, rattling through the misty streets of London toward what would prove one of the most chilling and confounding cases I had yet encountered in the company of Sherlock Holmes. The fog thickened as our cab left the gaslit thoroughfares of central London behind and ventured northward, the clatter of hooves muffled beneath a blanket of swirling mist. I sat beside Holmes, his figure drawn into still concentration. He spoke little during the ride, save to inquire twice whether I had my revolver with me, a question that, given the apparent absurdity of the case, seemed all the more disconcerting. Sir Alister Greaves opposite us appeared torn between anxiety and embarrassment, his large hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, and more than once he glanced toward Holmes as though seeking some unspoken reassurance. But Holmes offered none. He simply peered through the cab window, eyes narrowed at the blackened world beyond, as though reading signs in the fog no one else could see. Greaves Hall emerged from the shadows at last, an austere structure of grey stone and ivy, looming over its grounds like a brooding sentinel. The lamps above the entry cast cones of light into the mist, revealing a set of stone steps and a dark wood door. A butler met us promptly, stoop-shouldered and pale, though Holmes barely acknowledged the man beyond a clipped nod. "I would like to see the study immediately," Holmes said. "No one else is to enter while we inspect the room. Watson, bring your notebook." We were led down a corridor hung with ancestral portraits and muffled in thick carpeting. The house was oppressively silent, save for the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. The study, when we reached it, was a large, high-ceilinged room, panelled in oak. A fire had been lit recently, but the flames had dwindled to red embers, casting long shadows on the walls. Books lined two of the walls in orderly ranks, and heavy velvet curtains had been drawn across the windows. Holmes moved directly to the hearth. Above it, the portrait of Algernon Greaves stared down at us, thin-lipped, grim-eyed, and clad in the high collar of a bygone age. The oil painting, well preserved but cracked faintly with age, exuded an air of austerity rather than menace. Holmes studied the painting without touching it. He circled the room in slow, deliberate strides, pausing once to crouch before the fire, once more at the far corner where the rug met the wall. Then he returned to the hearth and turned suddenly to Sir Alister. "Would you kindly describe the voice as precisely as you recall it?" Sir Alister blinked. It was a man's voice, deep, yet not theatrical, calm, clear, not whispered, but deliberate, accented. No, not markedly. And the words, "Why did you?" That was all. Holmes nodded, then gestured to the hearth. "Watson, help me with this frame." Together we lifted the portrait from its moorings. It came away more easily than I expected. Holmes set it aside gently and leaned in with his magnifying glass. Behind the painting was nothing but wall, painted plaster, lightly cracked and faintly discoloured where the canvas had hung. Yet Holmes traced the surface with a gloved hand, pausing at a hairline crack that ran vertically along the right edge of the recess. He pulled a small tool from his coat and slipped it into the crack. With a deft motion, a thin panel clicked outward. "A hidden compartment," I murmured, astonished. "Of sorts," Holmes replied. He opened the panel fully, revealing a small recess, perhaps no more than 18 inches square, lined with dust and cobweb. And inside it, affixed to the wall, was a tiny brass grill. Holmes leaned in close. "An air conduit?" he said softly. "It runs deeper into the wall, likely connecting to another room in the house." Sir Alister looked thunderstruck. "You mean the voice came through there?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed." Projected from a hidden passage or an adjoining chamber, it would carry quite effectively into this room, particularly when the painting concealed the source. Clever. The positioning above the hearth gives it an illusion of omnipresence. He turned and tapped the frame. The effect would be unnerving, especially when coupled with darkness and anticipation. But why, I began, but Holmes raised a hand. We are not yet at the root. Sir Alistair, who else resides in this house? My wife, Evelyn. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Beckett. 2 footmen, a gardener, and old Simmons, the man who let you in. We dismissed the rest of the staff for the season, given the recent weather and our intended travel. Is the housekeeper trustworthy? Utterly. She has served my family for 20 years. And your cousin Edwin, he resided here permanently? No, he had his own cottage at the edge of the property, though he often used the library here. He was a collector of books, rare works on botany and natural history, brilliant if somewhat solitary. Did he have reason to dislike you? Sir Alistair seemed taken aback. No, certainly not. We were cordial, though distant. I was named his heir, but that was by his own request. Ah, and you haven't altered his room since his death? No, we left everything as it was, out of respect. Holmes turned to me. Watson, I believe our next stop must be this cottage. The night was deepening by the time we stepped outside again, the mist thickening into a damp shroud. Sir Alistair led us across the grounds with a lantern. The cottage, situated near the far copse, was a tidy structure, stone-fronted, ivy-wrapped, its shutters drawn tight. Sir Alistair produced a key and stepped back. Holmes opened the door and entered first. We followed. The air within was cold and tinged with the scent of dried herbs. The cottage was impeccably organized, almost unnaturally so. Every surface was neat. Bookshelves groaned with volumes arranged by subject and height. A writing desk in the corner bore a single unlit lamp, a sheaf of papers, and an inkwell. Holmes moved about the room swiftly, running his fingers along the spines of books, opening drawers, testing the floorboards. At last he stopped before the desk and examined the papers. "There is something odd here," he said. He passed me a page. The handwriting was precise, even elegant, but the content was gibberish, words strung together with no coherence. Verdant echoes arise when copper devours time, and yet the birds remember nothing but ash. I looked at Holmes, perplexed. "Some form of code?" I asked. "Possibly," Holmes said, "or the scribblings of a man in disarray. Either way, it suggests mental strain, either manufactured or real." He leaned over the desk, picked up a small leather-bound journal, and flipped through it. "This is more useful. A log of activities, dates, times, mentions of voices. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death, reads simply, 'The voice speaks again. Beneath Algernon, the words burn.'" Sir Alistair paled. He heard it too? Apparently. Holmes snapped the journal shut. "There is more here than a prank or a family grudge, Watson. We are dealing with layered intent, someone who planned to use the illusion of a ghostly voice to unsettle, to accuse, perhaps even to cover a crime." He looked at Sir Alistair with fresh scrutiny. "Tomorrow I shall require access to the house's architectural plans, particularly its ventilation system and any changes made over the past 20 years. In the meantime, no one is to enter the study. I shall see to it myself." "Good. Then let us retire for the evening. I believe tomorrow will bring us closer to the voice's true origin, and with it, the motive it was meant to conceal." As we made our way back across the darkened lawn, I could not help but glance back toward the house. High in the study window, I imagined I saw the faint outline of the painting once more, the eyes of Algernon Greaves staring through the fog. Yet I knew now that behind that painted glare lurked not spectres or spirits, but something altogether more human and far more dangerous. We rose early the next morning, greeted by a low-hanging mist that clung to the hedges and gave the gardens a spectral pallor. Holmes, invigorated by the night's discoveries, had taken only a few hours' rest. I found him already dressed, seated in a winged armchair near the fireplace of our guest quarters, a tray of untouched breakfast beside him, and the small leather journal from Edwin Greaves' cottage open on his lap. He did not look up as I entered. "Watson," he said, "how often it is that the living find it convenient to silence the dead." I paused, still buttoning my waistcoat. "You've drawn a conclusion?" "A direction, at least. The facts are mounting in a rather orderly fashion, though the final figure is not yet complete." He stood and closed the book with a snap. "Come. Sir Alistair has prepared the plans I requested, and I mean to inspect the rest of the house before luncheon." We found Sir Alistair in his library, the very image of dignity undermined by apprehension. Spread across the large central table were faded blueprints, some clearly original to the estate's early construction, others marked with modern annotations. Holmes studied the papers with brisk efficiency, scanning walls, dimensions, shafts, and the peculiar maze of ventilation ducts that crisscrossed the older portions of the house. His finger stopped on a thickened wall between the study and an unused guest room directly behind it. "Here," he murmured. "This wall was reinforced around 1860, and this," he tapped a fine pencil line, "is an old servant's access duct that was never sealed, merely bricked up at one end. The passage runs directly behind the hearth and out through what is now the linen closet in the west corridor." Sir Alistair peered closer. "That closet hasn't been touched in years." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and it was never truly intended to hold linens. Come, Watson." We made our way through the west wing of the house, the hallway narrowing and darkening as we progressed. The corridor was unused, dust lay undisturbed on the skirting boards. Holmes halted before a tall, narrow door. The closet beyond was deep and ill-lit. Holmes ducked in, his lantern casting long beams against the walls. "Watson, here, note the stone. This rear wall was bricked at a different time. The colour, the mortar, it's clear." He tapped a brick near the base. It sounded hollow. Without another word, Holmes retrieved a small metal instrument from his pocket, one I had seen him use to manipulate locks and loosen panels. He inserted it into a crevice, twisted, and with a faint groan, a portion of the wall shifted inward. Behind it, a crawl space, narrow, cobwebbed, and choked with dust, yawned into darkness. Holmes knelt and inspected the interior. "Just large enough for someone to crouch in, and see here, scratches in the brick as if from boots, fibres on the floor, wool perhaps from a coat. And this." He picked up a small metallic object. "A spent match, recently struck." I leaned in. "So someone was hiding in there, speaking through the air shaft to the study?" Holmes nodded. "Undoubtedly, and if the passage loops back to the cottage, or anywhere with a secondary access, it may have been used more than once without detection, an ideal stage for illusion." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Let us return to the study. There is something else I wish to examine before breakfast is declared altogether abandoned." We retraced our steps, Holmes pausing only to seal the hidden space once more. In the study, the fire had been reignited and the painting restored to its position above the hearth. Holmes did not approach it. Instead, he moved to the bookshelves and began scanning titles, pulling volumes at seemingly random intervals. "Sir Alistair," he said as the baronet entered, "have you or your wife removed any books from this room in the past month?" "Only a few for light reading. Why?" Holmes withdrew a volume titled Meditations on Political Philosophy, opened it, and nodded. This one has not been read in years, and yet... He turned the cover to reveal a small tear in the end paper and, lodged inside, a folded scrap of paper. He opened it carefully. I leaned over and read the hastily scrawled message. E.G. knows, but he cannot speak to what he does not truly understand. The voice was only ever a question, but someone wants an answer. Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me and turned to Sir Alistair. "Did your cousin have enemies?" "None that I know of," the man replied, now visibly shaken. "He was largely isolated, but he was inquisitive, relentlessly so. He believed everyone hid something." "A dangerous philosophy," Holmes said softly. He returned to the hearth, stood before the portrait of Algernon, and removed it once again. He knelt before the concealed grille and examined it with new purpose. There is more than mischief in this passage. Someone engineered this illusion to unnerve, yes, but also to provoke, to suggest guilt. He stood, eyes narrowing. But guilt is a delicate thing. It must be placed precisely, otherwise it falls to the wrong shoulders. Just then Mrs. Beckett appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands in her apron. "Begging your pardon, sirs, but Lady Evelyn requests your presence in the parlour. She's in distress." Holmes was already moving. "Come, Watson, we may be closing in." Lady Evelyn Greaves was a woman of elegant bearing, her composure only partially eroded by fear. She stood near the tall windows of the parlour, hands clasped tightly. Her cheeks were flushed, her expression troubled. "I didn't want to speak of it," she said without preamble. "But last night, after you left the study, after the voice, someone left something under my door." She handed Holmes a folded piece of pale parchment. He opened it carefully. There were just 4 words printed in a neat, deliberate hand. "He drowned for you." Holmes studied it in silence, then passed it to me. I read it with a shiver. "This was pushed under your door? Did you see anyone?" "No, I found it this morning, just before dawn." "Do you recognize the handwriting?" She shook her head, though her hands trembled faintly. Holmes nodded, then turned to Sir Alistair, who stood behind his wife, face grave. "Sir Alistair," Holmes said quietly, "I suggest you post a guard near your wife's door tonight, and under no circumstances is she to be left alone in that wing of the house." Sir Alistair frowned. "Do you believe she's in danger?" "I believe someone wants her to believe she's in danger. But behind that illusion may lie a real threat." He turned to me as we exited the room. "Watson, what do you make of it all?" I considered. "The message, it's clearly personal. Someone is accusing Lady Evelyn of complicity in Edwin's death, whether true or not. The speaker, whoever he is, intends to draw something out of her. A confession, perhaps?" Holmes nodded approvingly. "Excellent, my dear fellow. Someone is using theatrics not merely to frighten, but to pressure, to crack the surface of a carefully arranged facade." He paused at the bottom of the staircase and looked upward toward the rooms above. "Tonight," he said, "the voice must speak again. And this time, Watson, we shall be listening." We returned to the study in silence, the fireplace crackling gently, and the portrait once again staring down from its place on the wall. But now the face of Algernon Greaves seemed less impassive and more knowing, as though he, too, waited for the final revelation, hidden behind whispers, shadows, and the artifice of guilt. Holmes stood before the hearth, hands behind his back. "Tonight," he murmured, "we catch a ghost." And with that, the trap was laid. The house was silent as a mausoleum when we took our positions that night. Holmes had instructed Sir Alistair to retire as usual, though he posted Simmons discreetly in the hallway outside Lady Evelyn's chambers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beckett, had been informed that a pestering draught required attention in the study, a ruse that allowed Holmes and me to conceal ourselves behind the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the hearth without arousing suspicion. The study was unlit, but for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. Holmes, ever precise, had calculated the time of previous occurrences. The voice had spoken each time between 11 and midnight. It was now 10:15. We waited in stillness. Our hiding place was close and stifling. I could hear Holmes breathing beside me, calm and measured, his attention sharpened to a scalpel's edge. A sliver of space between the curtains allowed me a partial view of the room. The high-backed leather chair, the shelves of books in tidy rows, the ominous portrait of Algernon Greaves looming above the hearth, its painted eyes now seeming to leer in anticipation. Minutes passed, 15, then 30. The air grew heavier, the embers dimmer. I began to wonder if the ghostly provocateur would fail to appear. Holmes, however, remained as motionless as ever, eyes fixed on the darkened chamber. Then, just before the stroke of 11, a soft sound, a faint scrape like wood on stone. Holmes tensed. I held my breath. It came again, not from the door, but from within the wall itself, behind the hearth. And then the voice, soft, male, and terrifying in its clarity. "Why did you?" It echoed slightly, the acoustics warped by the hollow shaft, but the words were unmistakable. Holmes reacted instantly. He slipped from behind the curtain in a silent motion, gesturing for me to remain. With swift precision he crouched before the hearth and inserted his tool into the hidden panel. It sprang open with a quiet click. The crawl space was empty. Holmes did not hesitate. He reached inside, withdrew a small lantern from his coat, and lit it with a silent strike of his match. Without a glance at me, he disappeared into the recess. I waited tensely. Seconds stretched into minutes, then movement, a sound from the corridor. I stepped back behind the curtain just as the door to the study creaked open. A figure entered, cloaked, hooded, holding something in one hand. I squinted through the gap in the curtain. The figure approached the fireplace and placed a folded sheet of paper upon the mantel, directly beneath the portrait. Then the figure turned and froze. Holmes stood in the doorway behind them, his lantern casting a cone of light that struck the intruder full in the face. "Good evening," Holmes said coldly. The figure was revealed to be a woman, early middle age, sharp features, severe eyes. She wore a servant's cloak, but not one I recognized. Holmes advanced slowly. "Miss Caroline Lockwood, is it not? Former companion to Lady Evelyn before her marriage." The woman's face twisted. "You shouldn't be here." "Nor should you," Holmes replied. "I found the second entrance to the passage, the bricked alcove behind the eastern wall. You have a key to the groundskeeper's cellar. From there, the conduit leads into this very house. Ingenious." I stepped forward then, revolver in hand, and retrieved the note from the mantel. It was identical in style to the one Lady Evelyn had received. "He saw you?" The water kept his silence. Holmes turned to the woman. "Miss Lockwood, you were dismissed from service over a year ago. Why return now? Why these messages? Why impersonate a voice from the dead?" Her chin lifted defiantly. "Because the dead should speak. Because Edwin Greaves died for nothing, and no one seems to care." "You claim he was murdered?" She said nothing, but the look in her eyes gave the answer. Holmes nodded slowly. "You and Edwin corresponded. You confided in one another, did you not?" "He trusted me," she said bitterly. I was the only one who didn't treat him like a lunatic. But even Edwin, for all his curiosity, didn't fully understand what he had uncovered. The journal, the strange writings, they were fragments, glimpses of a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. Her composure faltered. He came to me, said he'd overheard something about Lady Evelyn, about a secret from her past. He was frightened. Said he thought he'd heard someone following him around the house at night. And then he was found drowned, I said grimly. In water shallow enough to wade through, she snapped. He never drank heavily, never. They said he stumbled in a drunken stupor, but I know better. He was silenced. Holmes folded his arms. And so you took it upon yourself to resurrect his voice. To shake the truth loose, someone in this house knows what happened. The voice was meant to unsettle, to dredge up guilt. I thought if she believed he was haunting her, she'd confess. She, meaning Lady Evelyn? Yes. Holmes stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You chose drama over evidence. You fabricated a haunting to expose what you believed was a crime. Caroline Lockwood's jaw set. I had no other means. Holmes was silent for a moment, then gestured to the journal in his hand. Tell me, what was the secret Edwin believed he'd uncovered? She hesitated, then whispered, He thought Evelyn had a lover, years ago before she married Sir Alistair, a man who vanished under strange circumstances. Edwin found a letter. He never showed it to me, but he said it hinted at violence, regret, and fear. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Do you know where that letter is? No, she admitted. He said he'd hidden it, somewhere only he would think to look. Holmes turned to me. Watson, the desk in the cottage, the false bottom beneath the top drawer. Do you recall it? Yes. He tapped it, but dismissed it. He was inviting us to notice it. Come, Miss Lockwood, you will remain here under watch. Within minutes we had crossed the lawn to the cottage. The chill of the night had deepened, and the mist hung like breath held too long. Inside the study, Holmes pried at the drawer. With a soft crack, the panel lifted. Inside lay a folded envelope, yellowed but sealed. Holmes slit it, open carefully. Inside were 2 pages, one a letter in a woman's hand, the other a newspaper clipping. I read over his shoulder. The letter was passionate, distressed. Evelyn's name was signed at the bottom. You said he would go away quietly, that no one would ask questions. But he never returned to Paris. I've written, I've waited, nothing. I beg you. If something happened, tell me. I must know. I cannot bear the silence any longer. I fear what I've done. The clipping was brief. Body found insane. Englishman identified as Thomas Markham. Foul play suspected. Holmes exhaled slowly. So Edwin found this, and suspected Evelyn had a hand in Markham's death. He likely confronted her, but she may have had nothing to do with it at all. We stood in silence. Someone else sent that letter to her, I murmured. Someone who meant to implicate her, Holmes said, or torment her. Either way, Edwin grew too curious, and was silenced. And the voice behind the painting, that was Lockwood's misguided attempt to finish his work. He turned to me with the glint of steel in his eyes. But if this was meant to draw out guilt, then someone still carries it, and we shall find them. We left the cottage in silence, the letter secure in Holmes's coat pocket. Behind us the mist coiled over the ground like a memory unwilling to fade. The next step, Holmes had said, was to catch a ghost. Now he meant to catch a murderer. By morning, the mood at Greaves Hall had changed perceptibly. What had once felt like the oppressive hush of ancestral solemnity now quivered with tension, like the taut strings of a violin moments before the bow strikes. Lady Evelyn took her breakfast alone and spoke to no one, while Sir Alistair, despite his composed bearing, moved through the corridors with an anxious stiffness, his fingers constantly twisting a signet ring that I noticed he had not worn the previous day. Holmes declined food entirely, which was never a surprise, and instead summoned Simmons to the library for a private word. I stood just outside the room and watched the exchange, brief and businesslike, before Holmes returned to my side with the crisp energy that often preceded a breakthrough. "Simmons is discreet," he said, as we descended the hallway toward the study. "And loyal to the family." He confirmed something useful. "About Edwin?" "About Caroline Lockwood." Holmes paused. "She was dismissed rather suddenly last year. Sir Alistair told us she left voluntarily, but Simmons remembers it differently. He says Lady Evelyn asked her to go and that there had been tension, raised voices in the West Wing. Shortly thereafter, Lockwood vanished from the household entirely." "Because she knew about Markham?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Or believed she did, but what matters now is that someone here took that belief very seriously, seriously enough to kill Edwin Greaves and to threaten Evelyn under cover of ghostly theatrics." We entered the study where the morning sun fell in narrow columns through the curtains. Holmes gestured for me to sit. "We must consider motive, Watson. Edwin found the letter, and suddenly he drowns under suspicious circumstances. Then Lockwood returns, playing the phantom. But someone, I am convinced, tried to silence her too. The notes slipped under Evelyn's door weren't Caroline's handiwork. No, her style was theatrical, yes, but always imitative of Edwin's voice. The note we retrieved last night carried a different tone, more intimate, more pointed. It referenced a specific guilt known only to the accused and the writer. And consider this. Lockwood had no access to the upper floors. She's been entering the house through the ventilation crawl space alone. But you believe someone inside the house left the more recent message? Precisely. Holmes stood, restless now, which narrows our field to but a handful of individuals. He paced once, twice, then halted at the fire. "Let us hypothesize," he said, eyes on the flickering coals. "Suppose the original letter was intercepted years ago. Suppose someone read Evelyn's confession, someone who recognized the name Thomas Markham and the implications it carried." He turned sharply toward me. "And suppose this person feared that if the truth ever surfaced, it would shatter not only Evelyn's reputation, but his own. You think Sir Alistair saw the letter before Edwin did?" "I think it is very likely." I frowned. "But what motive would Sir Alistair have to conceal it?" "If the affair with Markham occurred before their marriage, then it could still threaten his standing," Holmes interrupted. "You forget, Watson, the aristocracy lives not only by reputation, but by legacy. A scandalous past, however distant, weakens the structure of their identity. Sir Alistair may have wanted the matter buried to protect Evelyn or himself, but if Edwin began digging, he might have been seen as a threat." "Exactly." Holmes snapped his fingers. "And that brings us to the pond." He crossed to the writing desk and removed a small map of the estate that he had requisitioned earlier from the study's drawer. "Look here," he said, pointing to the sketch. "The ornamental pond, shallow, fed by a spring from beneath the house. It lies precisely along the old gardener's trail from the cottage. Now Edwin was found face down there, his walking stick nearby. Yes, they said he was drunk. But the autopsy, which I obtained this morning by telegram, shows no sign of alcohol. Lungs filled with water, no bruising, no broken skin. But here's the interesting part. Soil under the fingernails. He struggled against something, likely to lift himself from the edge. A push, or a sudden shove. Edwin may have met his killer near the edge and been startled, pushed back, lost his footing, or worse, held down. A knock came then at the door, and Mrs. Beckett's nervous voice followed. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, Lady Evelyn asks if she might speak with you. Alone." Holmes glanced at me, then nodded. "Show her in." Lady Evelyn entered, pale and drawn, her hands gloved despite the warmth of the fire. "I won't keep you long," she said, voice trembling slightly. "But last night, something happened. I know. Someone entered my dressing room. I had locked the door before retiring. This morning, the window was unlatched." Holmes inclined his head. "And was anything missing?" "No, but the top drawer of my bureau was opened, and something was left in it." She handed him a small item wrapped in silk. Holmes unwrapped it carefully. It was a single cufflink, gold engraved with the Greaves crest. Holmes studied it without comment, then held it to the light. "Sir Alister's?" She hesitated. "I thought so, but he insists not." Holmes's face was unreadable. "Then perhaps it belongs to someone else in the household." Lady Evelyn faltered. "There's something I must confess. Years ago, before I married, I was involved with Thomas Markham. Briefly, he was charming, reckless, and wrong for me. When I ended it, he left for France. I never heard from him again. And then you received a letter informing you he had died." "Yes, from an anonymous source. The letter said he had fallen into the Seine and drowned, that no one claimed the body. I was devastated. I never told Alistair." Holmes said nothing. The fire cracked faintly behind him. "Now these voices," she went on, "these letters, Edwin's death, it's like it's all happening again. Someone knows and they want to destroy me." Holmes gently folded the cufflink back into the silk and placed it on the desk. "You're being driven to guilt, Lady Evelyn, but I believe it is not your guilt that matters. It is someone else's fear, someone whose future cannot bear the resurrection of this past." He stood, his tone crisp now. "I will need to speak to your husband, privately. Watson, accompany Lady Evelyn to the parlour." When I returned 10 minutes later, Holmes stood alone in the study, gazing at the portrait above the hearth. "Sir Alistair denied all knowledge of the letter, of course," he said without turning. "But you don't believe him?" "No, and yet I suspect he is not the murderer." I frowned. "Then who?" Holmes walked to the door and peered into the hall. "There is still one piece missing, Watson, one final link. Whoever killed Edwin feared his discovery, but also had access to Evelyn's room. Whoever it is, they are inside this house still, and they are watching us." He looked at me then, eyes gleaming. "Tonight, we return to the passage, but this time, Watson, we won't be alone in the dark." I said nothing, though a chill ran down my spine, because it was not the voice we feared any more. It was the silence that followed. That evening, the shadows seemed to descend more swiftly than usual over Greaves Hall, as if the house itself were closing its eyes against what was to come. Holmes remained in a state of quiet intensity throughout supper, answering Sir Alistair's attempts at conversation with clipped civility, and avoiding Lady Evelyn's gaze altogether. She, for her part, looked paler than ever, her appetite reduced to little more than a bite of bread and a single sip of wine. I did not fault her. Even I felt a creeping unease, as though some invisible current had begun to shift inside the house, disturbing its very foundation. As the servants cleared the dishes and the household dispersed, Holmes gestured for me to follow him into the study. There he carefully locked the door behind us, crossed to the hearth, and removed the portrait of Algernon Greaves with practised speed. Behind it the panel opened once more, with a muted click. "I have adjusted the pressure latch inside," Holmes said. "It will allow the passage to remain ajar, Just enough for airflow, but not visibility. We shall take our position within and wait. I hesitated. You believe the killer will return tonight? Holmes gave me a look. It is not belief, Watson. It is necessity. We have been prodding at nerves all day, asking questions, finding hidden letters, exposing methods. If our quarry is watching, they will be driven to act. The illusion must be preserved, and we must catch them attempting to do just that. We extinguished the lamps and climbed inside the narrow recess behind the fireplace. It was tighter than I remembered, a low, dark tunnel choked with dust and cobwebs. The brass grille separating the passage from the study gave us a partial view of the room beyond. Holmes positioned himself beside it, his ear close to the wall, while I crouched behind him with the revolver in my coat pocket. The minutes dragged. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed 11. Footsteps in the hallway. Holmes did not stir. I strained to hear more. The study door creaked open. A figure entered, this time without caution. No cloak, no mask. The light of a concealed lantern revealed a familiar face, angular and severe. Simmons. The old butler moved with purpose, setting the lantern on the desk and removing something from his pocket, a folded scrap of parchment. He approached the hearth and tucked it between the portrait and the wall. Then he stepped back and spoke aloud in a low and practiced voice. "Why did you?" The effect was chilling. From our position, the acoustics rendered his voice otherworldly, reverberating through the grille. It was the voice we had heard before, calm, precise, and impossible to trace. Holmes inhaled sharply but did not move. Simmons then took another object from his coat, a matching golden cufflink. He crossed to the armchair where he placed it squarely on the seat cushion, then extinguished his lantern and turned to leave. Holmes burst from the passage. "Not this time, Simmons." The old man froze in the doorway. I scrambled out after Holmes, my revolver drawn. Simmons turned slowly, his expression that of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "I wondered," he said quietly, "how long it would take." Holmes stepped forward, eyes flashing. "It took precisely as long as it needed to. You were clever, more than I anticipated. The voice, the passage, the planting of evidence, nearly flawless, but you made one mistake." Simmons raised an eyebrow. "Only one?" Holmes held up the cufflink. You retrieved this from Lady Evelyn's dressing room, but you left it in the wrong place. A butler does not place anything on a lady's seat cushion, not unless he wants it to be found. You overplayed your hand." Simmons gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. "That's your great revelation?" "No," Holmes said coolly. "My revelation is this. You were Thomas Markham's brother." Silence fell. Even I stared in astonishment. Simmons blinked slowly, then stepped back into the study. Holmes advanced. "You changed your name years ago, buried your origins when Markham fled the country after a scandal. When his body was found in the Seine, you learned of it before anyone. You came to serve the Greaves family, not by accident, but by design." Simmons said nothing. "You blamed Lady Evelyn for his death," Holmes continued. "You found the letter Edwin had hidden, perhaps years ago, perhaps recently. Either way, you realized he was close to discovering the truth. You couldn't allow it. So you made it look like an accident, a slip, a fall, nothing to see." Holmes gestured to the desk, and when Caroline Lockwood returned, trying to resurrect Edwin's voice, you took over her method, refined it, whispered threats, planted notes. You wanted Evelyn to suffer, not only through fear, but guilt. Simmons finally spoke. "He loved her," he said, "and she ruined him. She told him to run to Paris, and then she let him die, alone. She never spoke his name again." He was reckless, Holmes said. A man with enemies, debts. He might have died regardless, but his death was not hers to carry, and you know it. Simmons turned toward the hearth, his shoulders sinking. But someone must answer. You've made them all answer, Holmes said gently. Edwin died. Caroline nearly lost her mind. Evelyn lives in terror, and now so will you. Scotland Yard will want every detail, every footstep, every whispered word. There was a long silence. Then Simmons slowly held out his hands. I'll go quietly. And so he did. The next morning dawned with a surprising warmth, as if nature itself sought to cleanse the last remnants of the deception that had lingered in the halls of Greaves. Lady Evelyn remained in her room, and Sir Alister accompanied Holmes and me to the station, where Simmons was placed into the custody of Inspector Lestrade. Holmes offered no flourishes, no explanations, no speeches. He simply handed over a sealed letter containing his deductions and stepped back. As the train pulled away, I turned to him. You were remarkably restrained. There was nothing left to deduce, Holmes said. Only to record. The moment Simmons used the passage to deliver the second cufflink, he confessed his authorship of the voice. The rest was deduction and revenge. And Evelyn? She will recover, as will Sir Alister. Truth is rarely gentle, but it is cleansing. We returned to Baker Street that evening. Holmes resumed his usual habits, violin, pipe, monograph. But as I wrote the last lines of my account, I paused and looked up at him. You know, I said, I used to think ghosts were mere invention. Holmes did not look away from his violin. They are, Watson, but so are lies, and both, when used with skill, can haunt the living. And with that, he resumed playing, a quiet, deliberate melody that drifted through the room like the last words of a voice behind a painting. The weeks that followed our return to Baker Street passed with a kind of quiet reflection that I had come to recognize in Holmes after particularly complex cases. He had once told me that the most satisfying resolutions were not those that astonished, but those that proved inevitable in hindsight, like a cipher finally yielding to the correct key. The Greaves Hall affair, as the papers later called it, never made the front page. Inspector Lestrade, ever sensitive to scandal among the gentry, had ensured that Simmons's identity and motive were kept from the press. The official report listed him as a long-serving domestic who had succumbed to mental disturbance resulting from grief. The matter was considered closed. No mention was made of air shafts, spectral voices, or a hidden portrait panel. That, I suppose, was for the best. Yet for Holmes the case lingered, not because of its complexity, but because of the emotional wreckage it left behind. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Simmons's arrest, I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes seated by the window, reading over a letter with a faint frown. He did not look up as I entered. "You've had news?" I asked, removing my gloves. "From Sir Alister," he replied. "A short note. It appears Greaves Hall has undergone several alterations. The portrait has been removed, the passage sealed. Evelyn has taken to walking in the mornings, and Simmons has been transferred to an asylum pending further evaluation. A quiet end to a violent design." I nodded slowly. "It's more peace than I expected." Holmes glanced up. One brow arched. "Peace, Watson, is a condition the living assign to their own consciences. It is rarely a state awarded to the dead." He turned his attention back to the letter, then folded it with precision, and slid it into a drawer. "I've been thinking," he said, "about Edwin Greaves." "In what sense?" "In the sense that he died searching for truth, and yet, even now, I wonder if he ever fully understood what he had uncovered." "He discovered the letter?" "Yes, but not its context." Holmes stood and began pacing slowly. "Let us revisit for a moment the timeline. Thomas Markham dies in Paris. murdered, or so it appears. Evelyn receives a letter, anonymous, warning her that he is gone. Then silence. Years pass. She marries Sir Alistair, and then Edwin stumbles upon the past. I nodded. He finds her letter, hidden or forgotten. He realizes Markham's death might not have been chance. Precisely. But consider, who sent the letter to Evelyn? Not the authorities, not Markham's friends, someone who wanted her to know, but not publicly. Simmons, I said. Holmes turned. Simmons, yes, or someone acting for him. But here is the rub, Watson. Why alert Evelyn at all? Why not simply confront her? Why play the long game? Join the household, serve the family, wait silently. I thought for a moment. Because he wanted to punish her gradually, slowly, to haunt her life, not merely end it. Holmes smiled faintly. A theory, and not an unworthy one. But I propose another possibility. He paused by the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. What if Simmons never meant to kill Edwin at all? I blinked. But he admitted as much. He admitted to confronting Edwin, to fearing exposure. But there is nothing in his statement, nor in the evidence, that proves deliberate murder. No weapon, no mark, just a slip near the pond, a moment of panic. You think it was accidental? I think it may have been, but what came after was not. The voice, the messages, the manipulation of guilt, that was crafted, cold, measured. He looked up sharply. Which brings us back to the letter. That single act, sending it, was the match that lit the fire, and I believe Simmons was not the one who struck it. I stared at him. Then who did? Holmes did not answer at once. He returned to the window and gazed out at the street below, lost in thought. I considered the household staff, of course. No one else had motive or opportunity. Until I remembered one detail, Watson, a trifling detail. He turned, eyes gleaming. The handwriting. You said it was anonymous. Indeed, but Evelyn described it. Delicate, precise, almost calligraphic. And Edwin's journal entries? Harsh, impatient script. But one of his notes, the one hidden in Meditations on Political Philosophy, had a different hand altogether. Smoother, quieter, practiced. He moved to his desk and retrieved a sheaf of papers. Among them he laid two side by side. One was the anonymous letter Evelyn had received about Markham's death. The other was the philosophical note hidden in Edwin's book. The voice was only ever a question, but someone wants an answer. Compare the pen strokes, Holmes said. The loop of the G, the angle of the S, not a match for Edwin, but almost certainly a match for Caroline Lockwood. I felt a slow chill climb my spine. But she said she never saw the letter. She said she never read it. That much is plausible. But I believe she was the one who intercepted it years ago when it arrived for Evelyn at Greaves Hall. Perhaps she read only the envelope. Perhaps she guessed its contents. But she kept it. And then, years later, when Edwin became curious, she gave it to him, carefully, quietly, letting him draw his own conclusions. Holmes walked back to the window. She lit the fuse. But why? Holmes's tone was thoughtful now. Jealousy, perhaps? Or indignation? She had served Evelyn closely, perhaps even affectionately, and was then dismissed without explanation. Or maybe she truly believed that Evelyn's past was dangerous and that justice had never been done. In either case, she held her silence until Edwin's curiosity offered her the chance to stir the ashes. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the implication. So, in a way, she was the first voice behind the painting. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, though I doubt even she imagined how far it would go. Simmons took what she began and shaped it into something darker. He folded the papers and returned them to the drawer. In the end, Watson, guilt is not a weight, but a shadow. It moves, it lengthens, it can be cast from one soul onto another until truth becomes almost irrelevant. I sighed. A melancholy business. All justice is, in the end, but still necessary. There was a moment of quiet, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Holmes straightened and reached for his violin. "I think," he said, plucking a string, "that I've had enough of spirits and silence for a time. Perhaps something less morbid tomorrow, a stolen ruby, a runaway bride, something with a bit of colour." I smiled, despite myself. "And a case without crawl spaces, perhaps?" "One can only hope." He drew the bow across the strings, and the room filled with the low, sonorous hum of music, richer and softer than the whisper behind the painting, but no less haunting in its own way. Outside, the city pulsed on in its tireless rhythm. Inside, Sherlock Holmes played on, and the ghosts of Greaves Hall, at last, began to fade. The following days in Baker Street were marked by a subtle but discernible shift in Holmes's manner, less brooding, more energetic. It was not so much that he had shed the weight of the Greaves Hall affair, but that he had stowed it away, neatly filed within that vast mental index of his, where facts and human miseries coexisted under cold classification. For my part, I continued to reflect on the case with a nagging sense of disquiet. It was not only the manipulation, the layered guilt, or the cold ingenuity of Simmons that lingered with me, but the uncomfortable notion that in the end, every player in the drama had been a victim of something, or someone. I shared these thoughts with Holmes one damp afternoon as we sat beside the hearth, a light drizzle tapping against the window panes. "Was there ever a crime so thinly spread?" I asked, sipping my tea. Everyone was touched, but no one held the whole dagger. Even Simmons. He killed no one with intent, only with grief and patience. Holmes looked up from the Turkish newspaper he was reading. "You touch on a fascinating notion, Watson, that of moral diffusion. The idea that guilt, like light through a prism, refracts into subtler hues when shared among many. But make no mistake, there was a dagger, and Simmons wielded it. You still believe the push was deliberate, then?" Holmes set down the paper. "I believe Simmons did not set out to kill Edwin Greaves, but I also believe that once Edwin lay struggling in the water, Simmons chose not to help. And that omission, Watson, is a kind of murder." I nodded, though my conscience remained troubled. "And Caroline Lockwood?" "A catalyst, nothing more. She started a fire in a room full of oil-soaked drapes and then recoiled in horror when it spread. Her role was emotional, not strategic, but still culpable." "And Evelyn?" Holmes's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. "Lady Evelyn is the flame around which the shadows danced, but not the source of darkness. Her guilt was real, but rooted in remorse, not wrongdoing. It was her silence that allowed the mystery to fester. In a way, she was punished for what she feared she had done, rather than what she truly did." At that moment, there came a knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, with a letter on a silver tray. "Post from Hampstead again," she said, before withdrawing. Holmes took the envelope, scanned the handwriting, and opened it without hesitation. As he read, his brows lifted, slightly at first, then with increasing interest. "Well," he murmured. I leaned forward. "More news?" He passed the letter to me. It was written in a refined, steady hand, Sir Alistair Greaves's, I surmised. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I find myself compelled to write to you one final time, not to request assistance, but to offer clarity. You once said that truth, even when painful, must be allowed to breathe. I now believe you were right. After your departure, Evelyn came to me with a second confession. Not about Markham, but about something Edwin said to her in confidence before he died. It appears Edwin suspected someone beyond Simmons and Caroline, someone who had helped him piece together the strange puzzle of Markham's fate. A friend of the family, a visitor to the hall, someone who knew of Evelyn's youthful indiscretions. He never said the name aloud, but Evelyn now believes he meant my brother, Andrew. Andrew spent a great deal of time at the estate 2 summers ago and was known to walk the grounds with Edwin. I dismissed it then as harmless companionship, but in light of all that has happened, I now wonder. Andrew left for India shortly before Edwin's death. He wrote rarely, and since then not at all. I have attempted to contact him without success. It is possible, even likely, that Edwin confided more than he should have, and Andrew, foolishly or otherwise, revealed things to Simmons in turn, a chain of whispers leading to tragedy. I do not share this to open new wounds, but to suggest that the web was wider than any of us understood. You untangled it admirably. Evelyn and I are doing what we can to begin again. With deep thanks, Sir Alistair Greaves. I looked up from the letter, my thoughts heavy with implication. So the truth may go even deeper? Holmes nodded. Quite possibly. A secondary thread, less visible, more dangerous. Andrew Greaves may well have been the unknowing conduit, or worse, a deliberate manipulator in his own right. Do you believe he'll return? Unlikely, but not impossible. Guilt is persistent. Even when denied, it finds ways to haunt its owner. He rose and walked to the mantel, where the violin case lay closed. There is something almost architectural about this entire affair, Watson, he said, resting his hand on the wood. Each action supported another. A death from the past, a hidden letter, a dismissed servant, a resentful butler. No piece could fall without moving the rest. And yet the foundation, the original cause, was merely silence. Evelyn's silence. Precisely. Silence breeds suspicion. Suspicion invites curiosity, and curiosity, when untempered, becomes dangerous. He opened the case, removed the violin, and tuned it slowly. I wonder, I said after a moment, whether Evelyn's silence was born out of fear or shame. Both, Holmes replied. Fear of scandal, shame of impropriety, a familiar combination in aristocratic households. But she was not the only one who kept secrets. Edwin himself, for all his moral outrage, never revealed the letter openly. He, too, chose hints and riddles. Holmes played a soft chord, thoughtful. Truth, Watson, is a thing often hidden, not by lies, but by delicacy. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the melody he played echoing gently across the sitting room like the final coda of a song that had stretched across time and memory. At last I said, "Do you regret it, taking the case?" Holmes paused, bow mid-stroke. "Not at all. It was intellectually invigorating, emotionally corrosive, yes, but fascinating. The kind of puzzle that sharpens the mind and dulls the heart." "And the next case?" Holmes looked up with a faint glint in his eye. "Ah, yes, a small matter involving a diamond earring, a forged passport, and an unusually talkative parrot in Belgravia. Simpler, but with promise." I smiled, the darkness lifting slightly. As Holmes resumed playing, I leaned back in my chair and let the music carry me. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air held that peculiar stillness that comes only after revelation. And though Greaves Hall lay miles away, I felt, at last, that its echoes had begun to fade, not vanished, perhaps, but no longer haunting. As though the voice behind the painting had finally been heard, and in being heard, silenced. The first true warmth of spring had begun to steal across London by the time the last echo of the Greaves Hall affair faded from our daily conversation. The soot-streaked chimneys of Baker Street gave way to patches of blue sky, and the usual market clatter returned to Marylebone's side alleys, Holmes had thrown himself into a series of lighter cases, two involving missing domestic pets, one a falsified inheritance claim, but his mind, I could tell, remained anchored to that dim country estate and the intricate shadows that had danced behind its oil paintings and ornamental ponds. It was on an unusually bright morning in late March that the story threatened to resurface. I had just come back from a round at my surgery when I found Holmes in the sitting room, sorting through a parcel wrapped in waxed paper and string. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "We have a visitor," he said. I glanced around the room. "Now?" "Not in person," Holmes said, lifting the lid of a small wooden box within the parcel. "By post." I stepped forward and peered over his shoulder. Inside the box was a bundle of pages, each filled with neat handwriting, and atop them a brief note, unsigned and written in black ink. "You were right about him, but not all of it. There are things I cannot say, things Edwin feared. You saw only part of the truth. He saw the rest. Let the dead rest. Let the living remember." A friend of Greaves Hall. I stared at it. "Is this, Caroline Lockwood?" "No," Holmes said at once. "Different hand, more controlled, slightly slanted script, educated but cautious, and the phrasing is more intimate." "Evelyn?" "No." Holmes paused. "It is Andrew Greaves." I felt a jolt. "But you said he had disappeared?" "He had," Holmes replied. "But someone who disappears usually leaves a trail, however faint. And a man as methodical as Andrew would not allow the family's secrets to unfold without attempting to control the narrative." He lifted the bundle from the box and turned over the first page. "February 17th. If you are reading this, then I have decided to speak, not to the courts, but to reason. I never wished harm on my brother or his wife, nor did I desire Edwin's death. But I must tell you what I know, because silence has bred enough poison in our house. Edwin came to me late last summer. He had found the letter. Yes, the one from Markham. He was trembling with excitement. He thought he had uncovered a family scandal, something righteous to expose. But I saw something else in his eyes, not just indignation, fear. He told me he'd received a message weeks before. An unsigned note delivered to his cottage door. It read, simply, "Ask her what happened in Paris." That was not Caroline. That was not Simmons. That note, I believe now, came from someone outside the household, someone who knew, possibly someone from Markham's past. Edwin never showed me the envelope, but he said it bore a French postmark. Holmes paused in his reading. "You see, Watson, we believed ourselves to be looking at a closed circle of suspects, when in fact the edges were still bleeding. Someone with ties to Markham sent that first signal to Edwin. Someone whose motivation we still do not fully understand. Do you think Markham's death in Paris wasn't an accident?" "I think it may not have been the end of him," Holmes replied quietly. "Or if it was, it wasn't as accidental as believed. If someone else knew what Evelyn had written, if someone else had reason to draw the Greaves family into fear, then the entire foundation shifts." He turned the page. I begged Edwin to leave it alone. I said we had no proof, only stories, but he was already too deep. He told me he planned to question Simmons next, that he suspected the old man knew more than he let on. I warned him to tread carefully, but he laughed it off. 2 days later, he was found in the pond. I do not know if Simmons meant to kill him. I truly do not. But I believe something happened between them. Words, a shove, perhaps a scuffle. Edwin was not a strong man, nor was he cautious, but the water was shallow. It should not have taken him. Holmes frowned and tapped the corner of the page. This supports my original hypothesis that Edwin's death was not premeditated but the consequence of an emotionally charged moment. He continued reading. After the funeral, I considered speaking, but Evelyn was hollowed by grief, and Alistair too proud to admit what we both suspected. I left for India, not to escape scandal, but to bide time, to let the heat pass. I carried the weight of what I knew and feared what else I might discover. Now, with Simmons unmasked and Caroline's scheme exposed, I hoped the storm had passed. But seeing your deductions, your persistence, I realize you were the only one willing to look without bias. For that, I thank you. Burn these pages when you've read them. They are not for the law, they are for truth, the only thing still worth protecting. There was no signature. Holmes let the final page fall onto the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. At last, I said, he confirms your deductions but still shields himself. Yes, Holmes replied, and reveals something we had not expected, that Edwin was led into the investigation. The suggestion did not come from curiosity alone. It was seeded, planted by someone in France, or someone with ties to that life. Someone with a reason to reopen a door long closed. We may never know who. But the implications are vast. It suggests Markham's past was darker than we imagined, that his fate in the Seine may not have been chance, but consequence. I stood and paced the room. Then the mystery isn't fully closed. No, Holmes said, but it is beyond our jurisdiction now. The dead cannot testify, and the living have buried their memories in too many layers. He carefully bundled the pages and, true to Andrew's request, tossed them into the hearth. I watched as the paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. Holmes remained standing before the fire. "It is one of the curiosities of our profession, Watson," he said quietly, "that we sometimes glimpse the truth only through a series of falsehoods. Caroline's play-acting, Simmons's vengeance, Edwin's fears, each obscured the path but also revealed part of it. And now we leave the rest to time, to those who must carry it." I nodded, though something in me remained unsettled. Perhaps it was the knowledge that even the clearest solution may leave murky waters behind. Holmes returned to his armchair and I to my notes. Outside, the sun had fully broken through the clouds. London had come alive with the clatter of horses, the shouts of vendors, and the endless rhythm of its people. Inside, in the quiet of Baker Street, the case of the voice behind the painting had finally been laid to rest, not with triumph, not with celebration, but with understanding. It was a week after the burning of Andrew Greaves's confession when I finally penned the concluding lines of my account of the voice behind the painting. I remember distinctly the way the afternoon light filtered through the smudged panes of Baker Street, casting long shadows across Holmes's face as he read what I had written. He said nothing for some time, merely tapped a finger against his lower lip while scanning the final page. "I see you've spared no detail, Watson," he said at last. "I thought it important," I replied, "to record everything, the false starts, the misdirections, the emotions, the human elements," Holmes finished, with a hint of wry amusement. "Yes, I suppose there's value in that, for posterity. You disagree with my interpretation?" He closed the folio gently. "Not at all. Your conclusions are sound, your emotional fidelity accurate. But you see, Watson, where you saw a haunted house, I saw an engineered theatre. The tools were misused guilt and silenced love. But the structure, yes, the structure was that of a stage play. And Simmons, for all his supposed grief, was more playwright than mourner." I smiled faintly. "You always strip it down to its components, and you always restore its soul." He stood, stretched, and walked to the window. Outside, London bustled with spring energy. Flower carts wheeled past. Dogs barked in corners, and the bells of a nearby church tolled the hour. "Tell me, Holmes," I asked, "do you ever wonder what became of Simmons before he entered Greaves Hall, his life before revenge?" Holmes was quiet a moment. "Briefly. But the answer, I suspect, is what it always is. Some long-forgotten hurt that curdled. He did not begin as a villain, Watson. He became one in increments, inch by inch, day by day. That is how most men fall." He returned to the fireplace and stood, looking into its empty grate. "But perhaps the more fascinating question is not how he became what he was, but why none of us saw it sooner." "You did," I reminded him. He gave a curt nod. "Yes, but only at the end. That is the nature of these shadows, Watson. They move in silence until they cross the path of light." We passed the remainder of the afternoon in quiet companionship. I was about to suggest a walk when a small envelope arrived, hand-delivered by a boy in a newsboy cap, who vanished the moment Mrs. Hudson turned from the stairs. Holmes slit the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. He read it, passed it to me, then reached for his pipe. The note read, "I have left England. This country has too many echoes. But there are places where one may live without being pursued by questions or guilt. You once said that the past never truly dies. I think now that you were right, but some ghosts belong only to those who invite them in. I am learning not to listen anymore. Thank you." "Evelyn?" I murmured. Holmes nodded, tapping ash into a porcelain dish. "She's done the wisest thing she could have, left the theatre. Do you think she'll be all right?" "As well as one can be, carrying half a tragedy." I folded the note carefully and set it aside. We had received many such messages over the years, though few carried the same sense of quiet finality. There was no address, no return name, only the distant suggestion of closure. The fire had been laid again by Mrs. Hudson, and Holmes now lit it with a match. For a time, neither of us spoke, watching as the flames licked upward and began to warm the room. "I suppose," I said, "that if there is one lesson in it all, it is this. Guilt is not something you can exercise with tricks and whispers." "No," Holmes agreed. "Nor can it be passed from one to another like a debt. Simmons tried to make Evelyn carry his grief. Caroline tried to make her see her past. Edwin tried to force understanding with evidence. All of them acted as if guilt were transferable. But it isn't." Holmes shook his head. "It is singular, personal, and like a painting, no matter how large or imposing, it casts a shadow only when light finds it." The fire popped softly. "Do you think," I asked after a pause, "that Andrew Greaves sent that note to Edwin out of malice, that he intended to frighten him?" Holmes took a long draw from his pipe and exhaled slowly. "No, I think Andrew feared the same truth Edwin did, that the Greaves name, the estate, the image of aristocratic honour, all of it, was built on a lie, or at the very least an omission. He wanted Edwin to discover it, but he never expected the cost." "And the letter from France?" Holmes's gaze grew distant. "Ah, yes, the one thread that remains untied. Whoever sent it, the first seed that made Edwin dig, remains unknown, and that, Watson, is perhaps the only unsolved element of the affair." He turned and gave a small shrug. "But then, not every mystery ends with a confession. Some end with silence." Later that evening I finished my manuscript and packed away my notes. Holmes had retreated to his chemistry bench, where a new series of flasks bubbled quietly, and I took the opportunity to stretch my legs and step outside. The street was quieter now. The warmth of the day had begun to cool, and the clouds parted above to reveal a pale crescent moon. I turned over the case once more in my thoughts, its many layers, its false leads, its voices and paintings and letters and ponds, and I found myself returning oddly to Edwin Greaves. I had not liked him exactly. He had been prickly, impatient, and arrogant in the way of men who read too many books and understood too few people, and yet he had tried to expose a truth. He had believed in consequence. Perhaps he, more than any of them, had truly been the conscience of that house. When I returned to our sitting room, Holmes looked up from his work. "Did you enjoy the fresh air?" "Immensely," I said. He gestured toward the hearth. "Then let's have one more pot of tea and be done with ghosts for a while." As the kettle warmed and the night settled in, I wrote one last line in my journal before we retired for the evening. Some crimes whisper before they scream. And in the halls of Greaves, it was a voice behind a painting that told the story the dead could not. And with that, the case was closed.